Do you think that you have what it takes to make it into a medieval knitting guild? Because at the time, this was a way to make a living. This was a profession that you needed permission to do. To get in, you didn't show that you could just maybe knit a sock, but you had years of apprenticeship training, journeyman training, finally ending with an absolutely grueling test where you had to knit numerous garments in an incredibly short amount of time. And on just a small historical note, knitting guilds do show up in the documentation in the 12 and 1300s, which is the medieval era, but the entry requirements we're going to be talking about show up in documents from the 15 and 1600s, which isn't technically medieval anymore. So sorry about that. I'm going to go change out of this pseudo-medieval outfit, and we will dive into medieval knitting guilds. I'm so excited. Before I talk about the absolutely unhinged entry requirements for medieval or later Tudor knitting guilds, I kind of want to give a little bit context as to what a guild even is. They're not like crafting circles, right? It was a legal and economic institution. If you lived in a city where guilds had control, then if you wanted to sell products that were guild controlled, you first had to be accepted into the guild to be able to do that for profit. So of course you could knit at home for your own family's use and wear, but if you wanted to knit for sale, you had to be a member of the knitting guild. With guilds having that much power, they came up with a very standard process in order to be accepted into that particular trade. You started out as an apprentice, just learning the trade under the master. After so many years of apprenticeship, you would then become a journeyman, which meant that you would literally journey around the countryside, working under different masters in different guilds and shops to learn different areas of the trade or get different kind of trade secrets from different areas. It's a way to spread information before the internet. And journeyman is something that still exists today. So as many of you probably know, I'm originally from Germany. I was born and raised in my first few years there, and something that still exists is that journeyman tradition. One of the things that it's called is you can say that you're auf der Walz. They still have pretty strict requirements. You have to be under 30, child-free, and debt-free. It's traditionally 3 years and 1 day. You cannot go within 30 miles of your hometown. There's still a uniform that's worn. It's called the Kluft. I think it's estimated like around 500 to 800 journeymen are still traveling around Europe at this time. And as you can tell, maybe from the name journeyman, women were often not allowed to join many guilds. Some guilds were women only, especially some textile-related ones, not the weavers. And sometimes you could get in because you were the wife of a guild member, but generally speaking, especially the knitting guild, I would fail at step 1 because I'm a woman and I'm not married to a knitting guild member, so I'm not going to be a master of the knitting craft and accepted into a city's guild. So after you completed your journeyman time, then you would have the ability to attempt to be a master. And this is where the masterwork comes in to join a guild. We do have a few records of these knitting tests. Now, knitting guilds show up in the records, or knitting related guilds show up in the records as early as 1268 in Paris, for example. However, the really detailed laid out requirements in order to become a master, in order to pass that test, those were written down a little bit later. One really clear example was written down in 1683 in Gerlitz, and they had some pretty stringent requirements. So why don't we start with the guild statute from Gerlitz from 1683. Now remember, you've been an apprentice for years. You have then spent years traveling away from home as a journeyman just to come back and try to pass this test. You had to knit ein Spanisch Barett, ein Weiberbarett, ein Wollenhemd, ein paar langes Männerstrümpfe. It translates to a Spanish-style beret, a women's beret, a wool shirt, and a pair of long stockings. And you had 5 weeks to do all of this, including the finishing, which includes filling and shearing and stretching and getting it all ready for sale. Now, I guess it depends on what you're knitting, right? 5 weeks could be plenty of time to knit a pair of stockings if you're knitting a pair of stockings using an incredibly thick wool, but These are stockings from the late 1700s. We have a few examples in the museums. The gauge is tiny. I have knit a pair of Victorian stockings, women's stockings, so they're smaller, and the gauge was a little bit better, so I had a little less work to do, and it still took me, I think, almost a month by myself to knit those stockings. Then I would only have a week left to do 2 berets and a woolen shirt. Okay, hi, this is editing me popping in really quickly because I found an amazing resource as I was editing this video, and it is recreating a 17th century knit silk stocking by Lisa. I will leave the link down below, but she recorded the entire process of it 100% recreating a silk stocking from the 1600s. It took her 260 hours to knit, which means that even if she knit for 10 hours a day, it would take her 26 days nonstop, which is just under 4 weeks. This test is just incredible to me, to be able to do all of this in 5 weeks. She was able to do 1/2 of 1 pair of men's long stockings from the 1600s in under 4 weeks if you're knitting for 10 hours a day. Wild. Anyway, back to it. Again, the woolen shirt is not just a simple, shirt. The closest thing that I could find is a museum piece where they call it a knit sweater, which is incredibly detailed, incredibly intricate. These aren't just, one color pieces with no shaping and no patterns. This is very, very detailed work in tiny, tiny gauges. So now maybe, let's say I can knit a pair of stockings like in 2 weeks if I dedicated all of my waking hours to it. To make a sweater that detailed and that intricate, I do not think I could finish it in 3 weeks, even if I tried. Not only would my eyesight go, I'm pretty sure my wrists wouldn't hold up to that amount of strain regularly. Then on top of that, you've got to knit 2 caps or berets. The Tudor caps are really interesting. Sally Pointer has a pattern, a knitting pattern for a Tudor style cap. So I don't know, it would be interesting to see how long does it actually take for me to knit a Tudor style cap and fully finish it, including fulling, which is kind of like felting. You're kind of raising the nap, and then you want to shear it a little bit, and then you want to shape it really well. So that is also part of the test. Just finishing the knitting isn't enough. You need to get to the point where you can put this out for sale. I think it'd be an interesting test to see if I could do it, although I personally might have to resort to my knitting machines, which is an interesting point talking about the knitting machines. If you enjoy little historical tidbits like this, or you want occasional updates on what I'm working on, I'm actually going to be starting an email list that you can sign up for, and that's made much easier thanks to today's sponsor, Brevo. Brevo is a marketing, automation, and CRM platform that helps small businesses and independent creators manage things like email newsletters, basic automation, and customer relationships all in one place. For me, it's a way to share more thoughtful updates without everything having to live on social media timelines. I like that Brevo makes email marketing feel straightforward and accessible, even if you're not a marketing professional like me, and that you can keep communication organized without it feeling overly complicated or corporate. If you'd like to try it yourself, you can use my link in the description and the code EKNITS50 to get 50% off of Brevo's starter or standard plans for your first 3 months. And if you're interested in signing up for my email list to get those historical notes and project updates, that link is down below as well, just in case you'd like to. Thank you again so much to Brevo for making videos like this possible. And now back to Knitting Guilds. So by 1683, the knitting machine has been invented for almost 100 years. It was invented by William Lee in 1589. So you might think, why are there still hand knitting guilds anyway if we have knitting machines and knitting machines are around? Well, a few reasons. Knitting machines took a while. Just because they were invented in 1589 does not mean that it took off at all. William Lee was English. He presented his invention to Queen Elizabeth. She did not want that. It would kill the hand knitting industry. He ended up taking his invention over to France, but it took a while before it became somewhat commercially viable. And even then, I call them knitting machines, but they were stocking frames. So they were specifically meant just to make stockings. And yes, stockings were part of the hand knitting test. So you are still getting hand knitted stockings versus stocking frame or machine knitted stockings. But the knitting machines the early ones didn't have the capability of knitting to the same fineness as hand knitting did. They weren't as fully fashioned, so as form-fitting maybe as some hand-knitted versions. So they were overall just not up to the same quality that you would expect from hand-knitted stockings. It took a while for that to really get even close to that, and then they didn't do the berets, they didn't do the shirts. So while there was a segment of the market that was very happy for the stocking frames and machine knitted stockings, there was still an entire rest of the market that preferred or would like to have hand knitted stockings, and then there was also other garments that just couldn't be made on knitting machines of the time. Of course, over the course of time and in different regions and different areas, you had different requirements. There was a time, in Strasbourg, for example, that they had knitted gloves as part of the masterwork completion. But the next one that I want to talk about, because it is just astounding to me, is a guild requirement or guild statute from Frankfurt am Main in 1659. It reads in the original German: Erstlich ein Teppich 3 Ellen lang und 3,5 Ellen breit mit Blumenwerk versetzt, zweitens ein Barettlein, drittens ein Wollenhemd und viertens ein Paar Strumpf mit spanischen Zickeln zum langsten innerhalb 13 Wochen. So what does that say? I'll tell you in English. So the first thing, which is the one that really blows me away, is what they call a Teppich or a carpet. I don't think that this is actually meant to walk on. I think it would be a little bit more like a tapestry today. We have an example from the V&A that is just absolutely astounding, because it says mit Blumenwerk versetzt, which is like with flower work, done with flower work, which is like color work, some sort of design or style. This is a chance for you as someone who's trying to become a master knitter to show off your design capabilities, your eye for patterns, textures, colors, design, overall layout, and technique, of course. So just to give you an idea of the size of some of these, the 3 Ellen by 3,5, those are L's, which is a unit of measurement, and as far as I understand, they're like every city had a different basis for what an L is. As the closest I could get is that this would be a work that's somewhere around 5 by 6 feet, which is huge. A 5 foot by 6 foot tapestry in color work that you designed yourself, knit together with all of those other things within 13 weeks. So you have this ginormous knitted tapestry. You have a small beret, so very similar to the last one, that cap, kind of like that Tudor style cap, a woolen shirt, which again, we've already established this woolen shirt isn't like a very simple nightshirt or something. It is detailed and sometimes also has color works, often has raised pattern work and shaping. And even if you aren't knitting in the shaping, you again have to finish it. So if you're knitting it in separate pieces, you have to cut it to the appropriate size and sew it together so that it holds and can be sold as a finished object. And again, a pair of stockings, this time with Spanish gussets, which I wasn't able to find a ton of information on, but I wouldn't be surprised if that also meant that there was some fancy work involved. And it's not just a plain pair of stockings, but has something special to it. And a lot of other tests over the time also specified like you want them to be able to create cavalry socks or something like that. So not just basic plain stockings necessarily, but detailed, very specific, precise types of stockings that they wanted you to create. I can't even imagine attempting to knit a tapestry of that size and intricacy within 13 weeks, much less 6 months, much less a year. I'm working on the Hexi-Puff blanket, which you all helped me knit like 90% of, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to finish it within a year, and that's me not doing it by myself. So I am just blown away by the level of knitters that these master knitters were. I feel like you definitely earned the title of a master knitter at that point. Which, just as a little bit of an aside, there is a modern knitting guild which has like guild tests and requirements in order to be considered a master knitter. I'm pretty sure Roxanne Richardson is a master knitter as part of the knitting guild, which I think is so cool and is one of those things that I think might be kind of neat to see if that's something that I could do. But again, it takes time, effort, and skill in order to make it to that point of master knitting. Although I will be say that I'm glad that it probably won't include any of the apprenticeship or journeyman training beforehand. So what happens if you get to the point where you can try to test for the master knitter and you don't complete the work within the time allotted, or you complete the work but not to the guild satisfaction? One of the things that I've read is that oftentimes you'll be sent back out on your journey. So you'll go back to being a journeyman. There are a few times where it's referenced that you can pay instead of doing the test. So I wonder if there was some sort of payment system potentially if you didn't fully pass it. So now knowing what it takes to be a medieval and later Tudor master knitter, do you think that you have what it takes to pass that test? Again, I think I fall at the first hurdle because I am a woman, so I don't know that I would even be allowed to take on an apprenticeship, much less be a journeyman, much less take the master knitting test. But I do think that it would be interesting to see if I can try the 5-week version of the test. I know that there's honestly no universe in which I can pass the 13-week test. Making a knitted tapestry of that detail would take years for me. There is no way that I could do that, plus all the other garments within 13 weeks. But I think that there's I just want to see how far could I get on the 5-week version of the test. What do you think? Is that something that I should test myself on? Would you want to see that? Would you be interested? Would you want to try it yourself? Maybe we can find some knitting patterns that we can all try together and see which one of us could be accepted into a 15 or 1600s knitting guild as a master knitter. This was really, really fun to look into and to research. Again, I'm not trying to put myself out there as any kind of guild expert. In any case, I love the history of knitting and looking a little bit into the commerce of knitting as well, especially how knitting machines fit into all of this with how strong knitting has always been. I'm also very curious about home knitting and cottage industry knitting versus guild level selling and production knitting. So this is a really fun, slight deep dive for me. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I know all of our time is really precious, so I appreciate that you decide to spend some of it with me. There might be a video right here that you could be interested in if you want to keep watching something like this. Otherwise, I hope to see you all again very, very soon. Bye!